Welcome to this chilling true crime investigation that delves into one of the most haunting cases in recent American history, the disappearance of Kristin Smart. If you're joining us for the first time, prepare yourself for a story of loss, confusion, and enduring heartbreak. If you're a returning viewer, you already know that we dig deep into the hidden truths and unravel the secrets that others may miss. This is the story of a bright college student whose life was cruelly ripped away from her, leaving behind a family desperate for answers, a community shaken to its core, and a case that remains unsolved for decades. Today, we begin at the very moment Kristin vanished, unraveling the events that set the stage for a mystery that has endured for over 25 years. It was May 25, 1996, a Saturday evening, when 19-year-old Kristin Smart attended a party at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. The campus, which sat nestled on the picturesque California coast, was alive with the energy of young students enjoying the freedom of the final days of the academic year. But beneath this surface of youthful exuberance, a dark cloud was beginning to gather, and no one knew yet that Kristin's life would be altered forever. Kristin, a freshman from Stockton, California, was studying environmental design. She had a bright future ahead of her, and those who knew her described her as enthusiastic, friendly, and determined. That night, she went out with friends to celebrate the nearing end of the semester. She was seen at the party, laughing and enjoying herself like any college student might. But it was what happened after the party that would leave her family, friends, and investigators grappling with an enduring mystery. At some point in the early hours of the morning, Kristin decided to leave the party and make her way back to her dorm. She was accompanied by a fellow student, Cheryl Anderson, who lived in the same dorm. But the two women became separated on the short walk back. Kristin, by now intoxicated, had become disoriented and was unable to make it back to her room without assistance. Cheryl, noticing her friend's struggle, tried to help her, but eventually, they parted ways. Cheryl walked back to her dorm while Kristin continued on her own. According to Cheryl's later testimony, she saw Kristin at the intersection of Grand Avenue and Foothill Boulevard, alone and confused but still walking. That was the last time Kristin was seen alive. As Cheryl made her way back to her dorm, she had no way of knowing that this would be the last night she would see her friend. By the time Cheryl returned to the dorm, Kristin had vanished. The events that followed would set the stage for one of the most baffling cases in modern true crime history. Kristin's absence wasn't immediately noticed, but once it became clear that she hadn't returned to her dorm, concern began to mount. Her roommate reported her missing, and authorities were quickly alerted. The San Luis Obispo Police Department was soon involved, and a search was launched. It was the beginning of what would become a prolonged and frustrating investigation. In the early stages, there were many questions and few answers. Was Kristin simply lost in the night, or had something more sinister happened? The search expanded to include friends, family, and police. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the area, looking for any sign of Kristin, but the hours stretched into days without a single clue. The investigation also revealed that Kristin's last known interaction, while it was with her friend Cheryl, wasn't fully understood. There were no clear witnesses to what happened after that point. The investigation turned to the surrounding area, with police and volunteers combing through local streets, parks, and other public spaces. They questioned everyone who might have had contact with Kristin that night, including those at the party, and searched for any footage that could shed light on what had happened. They scoured the surrounding neighborhoods and woods, looking for anything that might point to her whereabouts. But as the days passed, the hope of finding Kristin alive started to fade. The disappearance of Kristin Smart didn't just leave her family in shock, it rocked the entire San Luis Obispo community. Cal Poly students, professors, and staff were all deeply affected by the news that one of their own had vanished without a trace. Kristin had been a promising young woman with a bright future ahead of her, and to see her life upended in this way was devastating. The campus, once filled with the usual hustle and bustle, now felt empty and fraught with fear. Students and faculty alike began to question their safety. How could something like this happen in such a relatively peaceful, college town environment? The unknown surrounding Kristin's case left the community on edge. and no one knew where the next clue might come from. Despite the initial efforts and extensive search operations, no leads came forward. Police, though thorough, were left with very little to work with. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the investigation began to feel like it was going nowhere. Kristin's family, especially her parents, were left to wonder if they would ever have the answers they so desperately needed. It was at this point that the investigation shifted focus. Authorities began to explore the possibility that Kristin hadn't simply disappeared, but that foul play was involved. Evidence suggested that she may have been abducted, though the details were still sketchy. The police turned to forensic analysis and began combing through the available evidence in greater detail. However, with very few physical clues to go on, investigators were forced to work with the limited testimonies they had, none of which were conclusive. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was the lack of definitive witness testimony and physical evidence. Several people claimed to have seen Kristin around the time of her disappearance, but the information was vague and contradictory. None of the potential suspects had any concrete evidence tying them to the crime. And as the months turned into years, the case grew colder and colder. If you're just as intrigued and troubled by the disappearance of Kristin Smart as we are, like this video and comment below your thoughts. Do you think someone in the community knows more than they're letting on? Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next part of this story will delve into the key suspects and theories that have emerged over the years. If you've followed Kristin's case for years, or even if you're just hearing about it now, share this video with others so that the memory of Kristin remains alive. Her story is still far from over. As soon as Kristin was reported missing, the San Luis Obispo Police Department swung into action. The clock was ticking, and the hope was that Kristin could be found before any real harm had come to her. Early on, the investigation was largely focused on the campus area, particularly the route she would have taken from the party to her dorm. Volunteers poured in from the community, and search teams fanned out, scouring nearby parks, alleys, and open fields, hoping for any sign of Kristin. Yet, as hours passed and turned into days, there were no breakthroughs. No one had seen anything unusual the night she disappeared, and no leads emerged. Law enforcement began questioning people who had attended the party with her, but many of these individuals offered little more than vague recollections of the night. Kristin had been intoxicated, and her last moments before parting ways with her friend Cheryl were blurry. With no clear description of anyone she'd encountered, the investigation quickly ran into frustrating dead ends. In the initial days following Kristin's disappearance, some of those closest to her considered the possibility that she had simply left voluntarily. The theory seemed to make sense at first. Kristin was young, she was away from home, and she might have been overwhelmed by school pressures. But this idea was quickly dismissed by her family. They described Kristin as someone who had always been close to her family and was unlikely to run away without telling anyone. She was described by those who knew her as optimistic and grounded, not someone prone to leaving her life behind. Still, the police were faced with little more than speculation, and without tangible evidence pointing to foul play, the possibility that she had simply wandered off had to be explored. But as the days went by, this theory started to lose its validity. No one had found anything, no personal belongings, no clues about where she might have gone. Her absence seemed more intentional than accidental. It wasn't until several weeks after Kristin's disappearance that a lead would surface, one that would open the door to darker possibilities. An anonymous tip came in, reporting a strange sighting of a man who had been seen near Kristin the night she went missing. The tipster claimed to have seen a man in a white car following Kristin as she walked alone near the intersection of Grand Avenue and Foothill Boulevard, not long before she vanished. The report suggested that the man had been watching her before offering a ride, a claim that immediately set off alarm bells. At first, investigators focused their efforts on tracing any potential sightings of a car fitting that description. They started to question people who lived in the area, asking if they had seen anything unusual that night. Still, there were no leads on who this man was, or whether he had even been involved in Kristin's disappearance. The sighting was nothing more than a possible connection that had yet to provide solid evidence. But for Kristin's family, this tip offered a glimmer of hope. It suggested that someone might have seen something that could lead to her whereabouts, and at this stage, any lead, no matter how tenuous, was something worth pursuing. As the weeks turned into months, the theory of abduction became increasingly likely. Authorities began to focus more on individuals who might have had contact with Kristin that night. One person in particular came under intense scrutiny: Paul Flores, a fellow student at Cal Poly. Paul, who was also a freshman, had reportedly been seen talking to Kristin at the party earlier in the evening. He had been in the same group of friends as Kristin and was known to have interacted with her during the event. However, the true nature of their interaction remained unclear. What struck investigators as particularly suspicious was that, in the days following Kristin's disappearance, Paul was one of the last people known to have seen her alive. Paul's behavior was also becoming a source of concern. He seemed remarkably calm for someone who had been involved in such a troubling situation. His composure was unsettling to those around him, and even though he initially agreed to cooperate with the investigation, he soon became less forthcoming. As the investigation wore on, suspicions began to grow about Paul's potential involvement, especially given the increasingly troubling details surrounding the case. Paul Flores had a history of trouble with the law, though nothing that seemed to suggest he was capable of committing such a heinous act. In the weeks following Kristin's disappearance, he was subjected to several interviews by police. During these interviews, Paul made several inconsistent statements, which caused investigators to question whether he knew more than he was letting on. One of the most suspicious moments in the investigation came when Paul was asked about his whereabouts the night Kristin disappeared. His account of the events didn't quite line up with what others had reported, raising doubts about the veracity of his story. He claimed he had been walking home alone after the party, but there were several discrepancies in his timeline that were never fully explained. Further investigation into Paul's past revealed that he had been involved in several incidents in the past, though none that were immediately tied to any serious criminal activity. Still, these revelations were enough to prompt investigators to take a closer look at him as a possible suspect. As the weeks turned into months, it became clear that this case was no ordinary missing persons investigation. The police had moved from hopeful search efforts to full-scale suspicions of murder and abduction. The community's sense of security had been shattered, and the looming shadow of uncertainty cast a dark pall over the investigation. If you find yourself on the edge of your seat, trying to piece together the mystery of Kristin Smart's disappearance, like this video and comment your thoughts below. Do you believe Paul Flores had something to do with Kristin's fate, or is there someone else responsible? Subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated as we continue to uncover the shocking twists in this case. Share this video with anyone who might know more. Every detail brings us closer to the truth. With the investigation still without answers, the suspicion falls heavily on one person, Paul Flores, whose actions and behavior after Kristin's disappearance have raised disturbing questions. But as we'll see, the case is much more complicated than it first appeared, and the search for the truth leads down some dark, unexpected paths. From the moment Kristin went missing, one name continued to surface: Paul Flores. Paul, a fellow student at Cal Poly, had been seen with Kristin at the party before she left for her walk back to the dorm. He was the last person known to have seen her alive, a fact that would later haunt him as investigators turned their attention toward him. Paul's demeanor was unnerving to those around him. Despite the ongoing search efforts, he seemed remarkably calm, almost detached from the urgency of the situation. In the interviews he gave to law enforcement, his statements were inconsistent, with several discrepancies emerging when compared to witness accounts. It was enough to raise serious concerns about his involvement, and the investigation began to zero in on him. But what made Paul the prime suspect wasn't just his proximity to Kristin in her final moments, it was his behavior in the weeks that followed. After Kristin's disappearance, Paul was reported to have made odd remarks to friends and classmates. He spoke of Kristin as if she were already dead, a detail that unsettled those who heard him. And then there was the way Paul behaved when investigators questioned him: calm, evasive, and ultimately uncooperative. He refused to take a polygraph test, a refusal that further deepened suspicions. In addition to his strange behavior following Kristin's disappearance, Paul Flores had a history that further cast doubt on his innocence. Investigators discovered that he had been involved in a previous sexual assault allegation during his time in high school, an allegation that, though never prosecuted, painted a concerning picture of his behavior. This background, combined with his inconsistent statements and strange actions following Kristin's disappearance, led investigators to treat him as their primary suspect. Despite this, there was no direct evidence linking Paul to Kristin's abduction or murder. No physical evidence, no witnesses, and no clear motive. But law enforcement wasn't willing to let him go. They turned their attention to the possibility that Paul had hid something that could provide the break they desperately needed. As Paul became the focus of the investigation, multiple theories began to emerge, each trying to make sense of what happened that night. One of the most widely discussed theories is that Paul Flores had planned the abduction and murder of Kristin. Some investigators believe that, given his calmness in the aftermath of Kristin's disappearance and his prior behavior, the crime might have been premeditated. The fact that Kristin was seen with Paul before her disappearance, and the odd comments he made later, suggested a more sinister motive. Was Kristin the victim of a stalking or obsessive behavior that Paul had been harboring? Did he see her as an object of desire and become angry when she rejected him? While this theory has not been proven, it remains one of the most unsettling possibilities. Another theory suggested that Kristin's murder may have been a crime of opportunity, a situation that spiraled out of control once Paul found Kristin alone and vulnerable, walking in the dark after the party. This theory posits that while Paul may not have planned to kill Kristin initially, his opportunity to do so arose when she was in a compromised position. The way Paul acted in the wake of Kristin's disappearance raised red flags. Instead of cooperating with police efforts and showing concern for Kristin's safety, Paul seemed to withdraw. His responses to police inquiries were inconsistent, and his failure to offer any real assistance or lead investigators in any meaningful direction made him appear less like an innocent bystander and more like someone who had something to hide. Over the years, more disturbing details about Paul's behavior surfaced. He had been known to have a history of troublesome interactions with women, including reports of unwanted advances and aggressive behavior. These revelations painted an increasingly disturbing portrait of a man whose behavior had escalated beyond casual missteps. Still, despite the mounting evidence against him, Paul Flores continued to maintain his innocence. For years, the case seemed to stall. Despite Paul being the prime suspect, law enforcement had no physical evidence to charge him. It wasn't until 2021, 25 years after Kristin went missing, that new developments would reignite the case. Investigators, armed with more advanced forensic techniques and fresh leads, returned to the Flores family home. During the course of the investigation, they excavated areas around Paul's residence and were able to uncover new evidence that pointed to a possible connection between Paul and Kristin's disappearance. Forensic testing on these materials suggested that Kristin's remains had been in contact with them at some point, though her body was never found. These developments marked a significant turning point in the investigation and brought a renewed sense of hope to the Smart family, who had never given up on finding their daughter. The discovery was not enough to immediately arrest Paul, but it was enough to suggest that Kristin's fate was closely tied to him, something the police had suspected all along. As of now, the investigation remains open, but the question of whether Paul Flores will be held accountable for Kristin's disappearance remains unresolved. Theories continue to swirl around the case, and while new evidence has emerged, it has not been enough to conclusively prove Paul's involvement. The Smart family, devastated by the loss of their daughter, continues to wait for justice, hoping that the truth will eventually come to light. The search for Kristin Smart has been ongoing for over 2 decades, and the questions surrounding her disappearance remain just as poignant today. What do you think happened to Kristin that night? Was Paul Flores the one responsible, or is there more to this case than meets the eye? Like and comment below with your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, as we continue to delve into this unsettling case and reveal the latest developments. In 2021, a pivotal moment came in the search for answers. For years, the Smart family had been stuck in the painful cycle of hope and disappointment. But the discovery of new evidence brought a sense of purpose back into the investigation. The key to this breakthrough was the advent of advanced forensic technology, which had been unavailable during the initial investigation in the 1990s. Forensic teams revisited key locations, including Paul Flores' home and areas near his property. New investigative techniques, including ground-penetrating radar and advanced cadaver dogs, provided fresh leads. This technology allowed authorities to search specific sites that had not been thoroughly examined before. The culmination of these efforts led to the discovery of significant evidence, a possible link between Paul Flores and Kristin's remains. This new evidence suggested that Kristin's body had been in contact with locations tied to Flores, fueling growing suspicion that he was directly involved. Though no remains were found during this particular excavation, the new evidence connected to his home led to renewed interest in the case and suggested that law enforcement was finally on the brink of unearthing something vital. In April 2021, after more than 2 decades of suspicion, Paul Flores was finally arrested. The arrest occurred after years of intense scrutiny, public outcry, and growing evidence that pointed to him as the prime suspect in Kristin's disappearance. Law enforcement charged Paul with murder, specifically in relation to Kristin's death. This development shocked many, but it was a moment of profound relief for the Smart family, who had waited so long for justice. It was a long-awaited moment of hope, but it was tempered by the reality that much of the case still rested on circumstantial evidence, rather than direct proof of his involvement. Paul's arrest was not just a personal defeat for him, but also for the system that had failed to bring justice for Kristin for so many years. The arrest signaled the beginning of a new phase in the investigation, one that would hopefully culminate in a trial where the truth would finally be revealed. While Paul's arrest was a breakthrough, it was only the beginning of a complex legal journey. Kristin's family, who had been waiting for years to see a suspect held accountable, now faced the arduous process of court proceedings, where the case would have to be argued and proven. The legal battle that ensued was filled with setbacks. In the months following Paul's arrest, his defense team quickly moved to delay the trial, challenging the evidence against him. The case seemed to stall as motions for bail and pretrial hearings caused delays. Despite these obstacles, the Smart family and the public were committed to seeing the trial through to its conclusion. For the Smart family, the road to justice had been long and uncertain. Their hopes had been raised time and again, only to be dashed by the lack of concrete evidence or the loss of critical leads. But this time, things seemed different. The arrest was a significant turning point in the case, and they couldn't help but feel that they were finally on the edge of discovering the truth. As the trial date neared, emotions ran high. The Smart family's frustration had been building for decades, and now, they were prepared for what could be a lengthy and emotional courtroom battle. For many, the question remained, would the evidence hold up in court? After all, the case against Paul Flores was built on circumstantial evidence, with no definitive physical proof directly linking him to Kristin's death. Despite this, authorities were confident that the evidence, combined with the mounting pressure from public support, would be enough to secure a conviction. The upcoming trial would be a test not only for the Smart family, but also for the legal system that had been unable to provide answers for so long. Throughout all of this, the San Luis Obispo community remained on edge. The town, which had once felt so safe, was now defined by its connection to Kristin's disappearance. The case had cast a long shadow, leaving many residents wondering how such a horrific crime could occur in their seemingly quiet, peaceful town. The media coverage of the case remained intense, with updates flowing regularly as new developments emerged. As Kristin's story resurfaced in the public eye, more individuals came forward with information, hoping to assist law enforcement and contribute to solving the case once and for all. The Smart family continued to receive an outpouring of support, with many expressing their sympathy and commitment to seeing the case through. As the investigation moved forward, one thing became clear: Kristin's story had touched the lives of many. The search for justice had become more than just about solving a single case. It was about holding those responsible accountable, preventing similar tragedies from occurring, and offering a sense of closure to families in similar situations. For Kristin's family, every new lead, every update in the case was a reminder that the truth was still within reach. But even as the legal process played out, they knew the ultimate goal was not just an arrest or conviction, but the closure they so desperately needed. The battle for justice in Kristin Smart's case continues to unfold. As new developments come to light, the fight for closure intensifies. What do you think of the legal proceedings so far? Do you believe justice will finally be served? Like and comment below to share your thoughts. Your engagement is critical in keeping this story alive. Don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications so you won't miss the latest updates on the case. Share this video to help keep the conversation going and spread awareness about the continued fight for justice. Kristin's disappearance marked a turning point not just for her family, but for a community and an entire country that had followed the case for more than 2 decades. Now, as the legal battle reaches its critical point, the stakes couldn't be higher. After Paul Flores' arrest in 2021, the case against him began to take shape. It was clear that this trial would be one of the most high-profile legal battles in California's history. The Smart family had endured decades of waiting, hoping, and facing countless disappointments. Now, they were faced with the reality of the trial, a moment that could either bring the justice they had long sought or deal them another heartbreaking blow. In the months leading up to the trial, a mixture of anticipation and anxiety filled the air. Legal experts, journalists, and the public eagerly awaited the proceedings, hoping for clarity. Yet, despite the developments, there remained lingering doubts about whether the circumstantial evidence would hold up in a court of law. Many questions remained unanswered. Would Paul Flores finally face the consequences of his actions? Would the evidence be enough to secure a conviction? For the Smart family, this was no longer just about the trial. This was their opportunity for closure. For years, they had been stuck in the limbo of uncertainty. With the trial approaching, they clung to the hope that, this time, their daughter's voice would finally be heard. Throughout the trial, the legal teams on both sides faced a complex task. For the prosecution, the goal was clear: to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Paul Flores had murdered Kristin Smart. They presented the case with a mix of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and inconsistencies in Paul's story. Though no physical remains had been found, the circumstantial case was compelling enough to raise serious questions about his involvement. The prosecution's narrative was one of manipulation and deceit, suggesting that Paul had preyed upon Kristin in the vulnerable hours after the party. They focused on his prior troubles with women, his evasive behavior, and the many holes in his account of that night. The prosecution painted a picture of someone who had used his proximity to Kristin to carry out a terrible act. On the other side, the defense team fought vigorously to discredit the evidence. They argued that the case against Paul was built on inferences rather than solid proof. There were no eyewitnesses to Kristin's death, and without direct evidence linking him to her murder, they questioned the integrity of the prosecution's claims. The defense suggested that the investigation had focused too much on Paul based on speculation and that there were other possible explanations for Kristin's disappearance. For Kristin's family, every moment of the trial felt like a step toward either justice or more heartbreak. Kristin's mother, Denise Smart, has been one of the most vocal advocates throughout this ordeal. Her determination to find her daughter and hold the responsible party accountable has been unwavering. Through every setback, she stood firm, keeping the memory of her daughter alive in the fight for truth. The family's emotional journey was exhausting and deeply personal. For them, the courtroom was not just a place for legal arguments, it was the space where they would either reclaim the dignity of their daughter's memory or face the possibility that her disappearance might remain unresolved forever. As the trial proceeded, the public's attention remained riveted on the case. This was no longer just a local issue, it was a national story. The case of Kristin Smart became a symbol of the pain that families face when loved ones go missing without explanation. It resonated with anyone who has ever feared that justice might slip through their fingers. Across social media platforms, the hashtag Justice for Kristin Smart trended, gaining momentum and spreading awareness of the case. People from all walks of life followed the trial closely, many hoping that the long-sought answers would finally be revealed. Through the media, the world watched as the Smart family faced an emotional reckoning, one that required not just legal answers, but a sense of peace that had eluded them for over 2 decades. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension was palpable. The closing arguments were emotional. The prosecution passionately described the brutality of the crime and how they believed it had been meticulously planned. The defense, in contrast, questioned the validity of every piece of evidence, calling into question the reliability of witnesses and suggesting that the case was based on shaky assumptions. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. In a case with no direct evidence of murder, the outcome seemed impossible to predict. Could the jury reconcile the lack of a body with the compelling evidence of circumstantial guilt? Would Paul Flores finally face the consequences of his actions? The moment the verdict was read was nothing short of devastating for the Smart family. The jury's decision would either mark the end of their agonizing search for justice or leave them confronting yet another failure in a system that had already let them down for so long. As this case remains unresolved, the Smart family continues to hold on to a sliver of hope. The legal fight may not be over, but each step forward brings them closer to understanding what happened to Kristin, and, perhaps, some form of justice for their daughter. Though the road has been long and full of uncertainty, one thing remains clear: the search for Kristin Smart's killer is far from over, and with each new piece of evidence, the truth is slowly coming into focus. Kristin Smart's case continues to captivate and challenge us all. The pursuit of justice for Kristin has been a long and emotional journey, but it's not over yet. Like and comment below, do you think the case will ever reach a final resolution? What do you believe will happen next in this ongoing saga? Subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated on the latest developments. Share this video with others so that Kristin's story continues to be heard, and the fight for justice remains alive. Thank you for following Kristin Smart's case with us through its many twists and turns. As the search for justice continues, we honor her memory and the tireless efforts of her family. Stay tuned for more updates, as the truth, at last, might be closer than ever.